This episode explores the persecution, imprisonment, and medical abuse of queer individuals in Soviet Belarus. It includes discussions of violence, discrimination, and sexual assault. Please take care while listening.
Hi everyone, this is Victor and I am hosting the Eastern Queer Up Belarus podcast today with Ula.
Always with Ula. This is our third episode, and today I'm going to be talking more because I made a little script about how queer people with more attention to sexuality persecution were persecuted in Belarusian Soviet Socialist Republic. And I will first note why, for example, there's going to be not much mention of trans people, only because I am not yet fully done on my own research on that. But first question is for me to you, Victor, is how is your knowledge on that? What do you have in your mind as a person who is not directly studying this, but have common interest in the field?
To be honest, the problem is that I feel that there is a gap, a lack of a broader picture in my head that obviously I know about some episodes of persecution, and I was witnessing some of them happening to my friends, for example, and I've heard something about persecutions in the Soviet Union, but I can't say that I have that discursive picture in my head, so I can't actually make any conclusions about it. And that's why I wanted to readdress you the question and maybe ask you if there is an opportunity to talk about it, connecting it to the statistics, so just to make it to make some conclusions, or to just give the mask of what was happening to the person who, for example, is not familiar to the topic.
That's actually a very important thing, especially in the context of queer studies, because as you know, right now in Belarus, queer people is very much targeted group by the authorities. And I wouldn't say that we had a time where independent researchers had the capacities to easily work with the topics. It's always had its limitations because of the fear of people who were persecuted. They were not able to give interviews, but also the archives that are closed and the limits of the information that we have. And a lot of them gotten in the 90s. For example, a big source is Baltic republics. But I would start with roughly giving the dates on how it all started, and also sharing some myths about the Soviet Union in the relation of queer people, because usually what you might hear or see when something is said is that Soviet Union was this liberating country that liberated women, liberated queer people. And that was true for a lot of republics, but not for all of them. And for example, in Azerbaijan, Soviet Socialist Republic, the homosexuality between two men were criminalized in 1923. Usually we say that, Stalin came, and in 1933, 1934, there was this big process of recriminalization of male homosexuality that was criminalized during Russian Empire. That is a lot of times not the case, because in a lot of republics, including Central Asia, it was criminalized even before. If you wanted to go with the numbers, I can just say that what started in the 30s had different tendencies and different measures, different environment around it. And here I will quote Vladimir Volodin, the author of the first brochure on Belarusian queer history, that I really urge you to read, everyone who is listening to this. It was published 9 years ago, And still, this is like the first and the only text on that. It's called Queer History of Belarus. It's pretty easy Googleable, but this is like the quote that talks more about the waves of the persecution, how intense was it in different years for BSSR. It can be observed that the number of convictions correlates with political eras. Thus, in the years of 1945-1954, on average, less than one person was convicted per year. In 1955-1964, there were on average 407 convictions per year. In 1965-1974, an average of 18.6 convictions per year. In 1975-1984, an average of 28.3 convictions per year. And in 1985 and 1980s, an average of 18.5 convictions per year. That is so, like, when I firstly saw the statistics, I was like, how is that possible? Because in my head, the persecution was like, oh, the Stalin times where they introduced the law, where it was a huge campaign, and then, oh, it just was a law. But actually, throughout the time, it became much more like systematized, much more routine. There were like different practices and there were different discourses because throughout the time, also like all of this giant gulag and like prison culture of the Soviet Union that was harshly homophobic and harshly bound to the idea of who you are, like are you active or passive or something like this, that also was influenced both with medical discourse all together, and that got like this extreme big numbers for me in the later stages of BSSR.
Thank you so much. I wanted just to make a quick note before asking you about Gulag and different forms of executions, actually. I remember listening a lecture about the metamorphosis of the 8th of March, the International Women's Day, which started as a day of women's liberation and celebration of gaining the right to vote and the right to work. And it also had this increasing dependence towards the end of Soviet Union to just become a regular celebration of a woman being a housewife. So this is an interesting dynamics. And I also would assume that, for example, I thought that there should have been more persecutions of homosexual people in Stalin time than in Brezhnev time, for example, but not at all, which is interesting. So, of course, I then wanted to ask you about the forms of this persecution and were they imprisoned as regular prisoners, were they sent to Gulag? Do we know something about it? Do we know something about the personal documents of these people and so on?
Yeah, we are very much limited in knowing the personal histories of people. What we know a lot in the history, like in the context of histories of people, is what was given as an like interview or sort of diaries and the later stages in the 60s and 70s when homosexuality was studied. But here we have like a big difference because most of these voices are male voices, and there were like some psychiatrists that were interested in studying that topic, and basically they were letting people like talk about it and cure themselves, but they even somehow had possibility not to be persecuted because of that. And sometimes there were like occasions where the fact that you are seen by the doctor, it could be something that saved you from persecution. But that's a different topic. And talking about Gulag, it's actually created a big problem in the Soviet Union because there was a huge amount of people that were living together, gendered, and had their own spaces, had their own rules. And in the cases of male prisons, that had a lot to do with violence, and especially with people who were persecuted for the articles that were bound to something that is like not respected in prison. But as well, like there is a big thing about women in Gulag prisons and how later, after Stalin's death in the 1950s, the Gulag administration started to see that as a problem that it should be taken care of. Couples should be split. I will even read one of the statements that was printed as a result of that kind of politics in the 50s. The Central Administration of Prison Camps and Colonies has information about increased instances among both male and female prisoners of sodomy, lesbian love, and other types of sexual perversion, including rape and syphilis infections resulting from this. Considering that this state of affairs is abnormal and that is likely to have serious consequences, I request that you study this phenomenon on the ground and detail, and then submit an elaborate report to the Central Administration of Prison Camps and Colonies of the MVD.
Wow, that's crazy, because were they using the same word sodomy as was used in the medieval charts and chronicles to describe homosexual people in the 50s of the 20th century?
This is a translation. What they used was something called muzhelozhstvo, and was bound to especially male intercourses, and especially male anal intercourses, I would say, because there is also different discourse of legal disputes on that. How do you define what is muzhelozhstvo? Can a woman practice muzhelozhstvo or not? And sometimes women were persecuted for this. In historiography about the period, there is this notion that men were persecuted in prisons and they were sent to jails, and women were persecuted in mental institutions, and they were observed by psychiatrists and got pills. We also have some notions of people saying how they, for example, were evacuated from school after teachers saw them kissing with other girl, and then how they were in special institution taking the pills and being checked if you took those pills or not. Actually, the story that I'm describing ended well, and when girl returned back to her school to finish it, actually, all of the students were boycotting the teacher that sent her to this mental institution.
Yes, I like how these intricacies lead to the fact that the courts themselves and the legal processes were queering women, accusing them of muzhelozhstvo, because this is something which, just from the form of the word in the Slavic languages, supposes or reads as something which could be attributed to masculinity and men. So I find it rather funny.
But I wouldn't have said that there was an often case. I would say that it's not even several cases, it's just occasional case that could have been possible. And also, it's not one were persecuted like this and the other one like that, because also what is very popular with women, and we have to also note that it is specific to women, is that not a lot of stuff is reported, because there are some instances of something called corrective rape, when a woman who was accused of being lesbian was just raped by the officers while being detained to show how to love a man. Returning back to the whole prison thing, I didn't say what was the sentence. Consensual anal sex between two men was punishable by up to 5 years of prison, and if it was done with violence, it was sentenced to 8 years. And for the time of BSSR, at least 600 people were persecuted for this article that we know of. Again, I couldn't find any instances of Belarusians talking about their lives and the outcomes of that, how it all happened, and so on. But what was a big moment for me when I actually heard the testimony of one of the people who was sentenced from Russia for this article, and I would like to read it as well, because it gives the sense of what it was like to be in this prison. And also, I feel it's important to talk about those kind of relations that are affecting the reality outside of the prison, and all of this Foucault discourse of how this relations between men, which is connected to violence, but still homosexual, there is a quote. I was untouchable, so to speak, a lowly person. You could only be used for sex, nothing else. You couldn't talk to them, other prisoners. You couldn't even sit on the same chair. We weren't even allowed to go into the TV room because all the respected people sat there. We weren't allowed to do anything. We had to get up before everyone else and leave so that when these aristocrats, thieves, criminals, and pickpockets woke up, we would already be gone. And we were only allowed to go to bed when all these lowlives had already fallen asleep. We slept very little, and basically anything could have been done to us.
That's just insane. I am so sorry to hear that. And of course, I have a question of how does one obtain this low status?
Basically, this story is about the person that was persecuted for this article. Like when you are persecuted to the article that is called muzhelozhstvo, you have no hope in prison. Like people know your name, and this story was also like after that kind of had a, maybe I'm too optimistic, but had a kind of positive outcome because by the end the person could have okay relations with one of the heads of the prison and then was like translating some stuff for the prison and wasn't that involved in this kind of intercourse, but that just gives the reality. Summarizing and giving more notions like to people who actually have been to Belarus, I want to talk about Kasparas Irba, who wasn't Belarusian, who was a Latvian queer man who was traveling around, was in Ukraine, was in different Baltic states, was in Belarus as well for a couple of months and hated it with all of his heart because it was boring. It was not exciting at all. In this like 12 or something like this pages, he actually like describes the pleshki. It's the common spaces where queer people were able to gather and be around each other. And also he just basically like describes his life as a queer person in Belarus, which shows what would it be like if you were, for example, queer Belarusian or like, for example, queer and speaking Belarusian in the environment like this? Spoiler, there would be no places for you because all of the spaces where queer people could meet up or the environment that Irbi was interested that is connected to theater, high culture, or like not the working class conditions were completely Russified. Like he mentions, for example, Belarusian as language only once in this text.
That's actually very surprising. I mean, the fact of the intersectional oppression is not surprising at all. But I was thinking that the dissidents, the people who were trying to preserve the Belarusian culture and to wait for the renaissance of the Belarusian language, it would make sense to collaborate with the other oppressed ones, namely queer people. So
True, but we also can't know that. Like right now we don't have any works on that, and Irbi was here just for a couple of months. It's not the time where you feel, especially if you're a dissident, that you are able to share those ideas or like introduce someone. But also for him, it was like just this cultural life, meeting someone on the way to the opera or talking with someone about literature that you met at the pleshki at the park. And usually those people were Russian speakers or even people from Russia.
First of all, that's good to know, actually, that there is not only legal discourse around queer people in Soviet Belarus. I know that we were mainly focused on persecutions, but at the same time, it's really good to have this kind of documents, which are not at all about the point of view of the law. But I was like, for the whole time you were speaking, I was really wondering how and why the sexuality was approached like this in the Soviet Union. So we were talking in the last episode that in the Middle Ages it was directly connected to morals, but I don't really, when I start to think about it, I can't really understand why homosexual people were, I don't know, on the way of building communism or something. What do you think about it? What's the problem?
I feel like it has a lot to do with the notion that the queerness is something that is not like natural in a way, like in the communist society. That is something like bourgeois tendencies or something that you will do out of pleasure, not a necessity. So if it's like this sharp and strict notion of what is allowed and what is not. And even like the ideas of somehow tolerating, of somehow just studying or researching. Like, as I said, research in the 50s is starting to be done because it's viewed as a problem. Like, it's already viewed as a problem. It's given like, we know that this is perversion and study this from this lens. That doesn't allow to have like free independent research on what is this. So it creates those patterns of viewing someone as being either mentally ill or just beyond the law.
Oh, I got it.
Again, as I wanted to say, right now we just have only one big systematic research on the topic of persecution of queer people during Soviet times. There is so much, again, to study, to have research with. I didn't mention a lot of literature, but it doesn't mean that I wasn't putting my footnotes in the description while I was thinking of those texts. So if you want to know more or get more information around the topic, you're welcome to go there. It's not only about Belarus, sometimes it's about the context of Soviet Union in general or Eastern Europe.
Thank you so much for listening, and stay tuned, because next time I feel that we're still going to be talking about persecutions, because unfortunately this is an inevitable part of the topic of our podcast. So,
but remember that we're hopeful while doing all that.
Yeah, that's true. Thank you so much.